In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding Promise.all in JavaScript. First, we're going to cover a conceptual explanation of how Promise.all works. Then we're going to get into a couple of different examples of where this is potentially very useful, especially like when you're using it for a fetch request. And then also we will cover some of the main differences between Promise.all and some of the other promise methods like Promise.any, Promise.race, so on and so forth. So first off, the conceptual explanation. Well, Promise.all is a method that you can use on the overall promise object that you get for free within JavaScript. And what this is going to do is it's going to take an array of promises and it's going to return a single promise. And this single promise is going to fulfill when all of the promises within your input array have fulfilled as well. So you pass it an array of promises, and once all of those promises fulfill, Promise.all will return a promise that will contain an array of all of the values of the promises that fulfill. Now, if one of the promises within the input array rejects, then Promise.all will reject immediately if any of those input promises reject. Okay, so Promise.all takes an array of promises that will fulfill with a single promise that will have an array of values representing all of the values of the input promises that you passed in. But if any of those input promises reject, then Promise.all will reject as well, and it will do so immediately without waiting for any other promises to fulfill. So let's look at an example here. So in this code right here, I have created a few different promises. Here on line 23, I create a promise by just calling my promise.resolve method and passing in some error. So it's going to resolve with the string some error. And in just a second, I'm going to change this to reject, which will make this string that I pass in a little bit more sensible. And then on line 24 here, I create a new promise with the promise constructor. And then I have this promise to resolve. And we're going to change this to just 100 milliseconds here. So promise 2, it's going to resolve a promise after 100 milliseconds with the value of quick. And then promise 3 on line 26 here, it's going to resolve a promise after 500 milliseconds with the value of slow. And then now that I have created these 3 different promises, I'm going to put them all within an array called promises here on line 29. And then I'm going to use the promise.all method. So I'm going to access the all method on the overall promise object that you get for free within JavaScript. I'm going to pass in my array of promises. And then once all of my promises fulfill, that is going to return a promise. And since that returns a promise, I can use the .then method to handle that returned promise. So I'm going to use the .then method. It's going to automatically pass in the values of my fulfilled input promises here. And that is going to be an array of values. And then here, I'm just going to console.log those values out. And then if any error occurs, I'm just going to console out rejected. So if I run this code here, you're going to see that I get an array of some error, quick, and slow. I get an array of all of my resolved promises here. So the promise.all method takes an array of promises here, and it will return one single promise. And then you can handle that promise using the .then method. You could also potentially use async await here. And then what it's going to do is it's automatically going to pass the values of your input promises. It's going to pass those fulfilled values as an array to your .then method, and then you can handle them in some way here. Now, if I have a promise that rejects here, it is going to reject this immediately, and it's not going to wait for any other promises. So you can see that now that I have a single rejected promise here within my promises array, it enters the .catch method because it rejects immediately, and it's not going to fulfill with any of the other values here, even if those promises resolve. Now, another really good use case here for this promise.all method is when using fetch requests. And why is this a good use case here? Well, if you are going to make multiple fetch requests in your program kind of at the same time, and let's say that you need to handle the values of the requests at the same time as well, one way you might think about doing this is using your kind of fetch method here. And then, you could onto this fetch method, you could add a dot then to this fetch method, and then you could handle the value here. And then once you have that value, you could do another fetch with inside of here. But the main problem with doing this is that you're going to do this entire fetch method, and then you're going to wait for that to come back, and then you're going to do this fetch method, and you're just going to kind of take a lot of time running these kind of sequentially throughout your program, because you'll have to wait for the first one to come back, and then you'll do the second one, you'll have to wait for that to come back, and then let's say you had a third one, you'd have to wait for that to come back, and that can potentially slow down your programs to a significant degree if you have to constantly do this waterfall of waiting for one fetch method to come back before you perform the next one. So a better idea would probably be to just run these fetch methods in parallel here. Now, how can you do that? Well, this is where you can use the Promise.all method. So in this example here, I have a function called getStuff. It's an async function. And within this async function here, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the fetch method and fetch this API here. So this is just going to return some dummy data from this API, and fetch automatically returns a promise. So I assign that promise to the constant promise1. And then here on line 43, I make another fetch request and I assign that to promise2. So both these fetch methods return a promise into these constants here. Now, as you can see here, I'm not doing something like this. I'm not awaiting these fetch methods right away. Because if I awaited these fetch methods right away, that would run these sequentially, meaning we would await for this fetch method to resolve, and then we would continue our function here, and we would await this one, and then we would kind of continue down the rest of our function. And that would run these sequentially. But here, I'm just allowing my fetch methods to return a promise right away. So we're going to run this code, and then we're going to run this code immediately. We're not going to wait for this one to return. And then on line 43, I'm going to use the Promise.all method, and I'm going to pass in an array of my promise1 and my promise2. And like I said earlier, this Promise.all method, it's going to return a promise once both of these fulfill here. And if any of them reject, then it would immediately reject. But this is where I use my await keyword. So I'm going to await for both of these to resolve, and I'm going to wait for my Promise.all to return my fulfilled data here. And if I call this function here, you're going to see that I do indeed get an array of my data here, in which each to-do has a title, a user ID, and completed, and so on and so forth. So this allows me to run my fetch requests here in parallel, potentially dramatically increasing the performance of my application rather than needing to perform this fetch request first and waiting this to come back, and then moving on to this one and not allowing this one to run until this one's completely fulfilled. That's potentially going to cause some performance issues and just a slower program overall, compared to performing both of these fetch requests effectively at the same time and then handling those values once they both fulfill. All right, so that is a very good use case for this Promise.all method that can have significant impacts in your programs. Now, how is Promise.all different than the method Promise.any? Well, Promise.any, it's just going to return the first resolved promise. It's not going to wait for all of your promises to complete, because Promise.all, it's going to wait until all of your fulfilled promises complete, and then it's going to return an array of those values. To where Promise.any, the very first time a promise fulfills, it's going to return that. And if any promises reject, Promise.any actually ignores it, and it just waits to return the first fulfilled promise. And then with the all settled method, it does wait for all of your promises to fulfill. However, it handles rejections differently, in which all settled, it's going to wait for all of your promises to fulfill or reject. And it's going to return an array of objects representing these promises. And it's going to contain whether the promise fulfilled or rejected. And then it's going to contain the value. And it might even contain a reason why your promise fulfilled or rejected. To where Promise.all, if anything rejects, it's just going to reject immediately and not wait for your other promises. And then the difference between Promise.all and Promise.race is that Promise.race is going to return the first fulfilled or rejected promise. It's not going to wait for all of your promises to fulfill. It's just going to return the first rejected or fulfilled promise, which that's also the difference between Promise.race and Promise.any, where Promise.any, it's going to ignore any rejected promises, to where Promise.race, it's going to actually return that rejected promise or any promise, the first one that resolves or rejects. So stay tuned for future videos where I cover all settled and race in a little bit more depth. I already have a more in-depth video on Promise.any, and I recommend checking that out as well. So thanks for tuning into this video, and I'll see you in that next one.